want to keep that promise. And the way that I do that is that I try to understand to the best of my ability what is the science of mind. What is it that we are talking about? Why would anybody want to agree to this? Why would anybody want to live with this? We have a philosophy here that says that nobody is responsible for your life except for you. You can't blame anybody anymore. Why would you want to do that? It's so much easier to be able to point the finger and to make yourself the victim and say, you know, my life would be perfect if you would all just change. My life would be perfect if I just had more money. My life would be perfect if the politicians would just get out of my life. Yeah. And so we want to give it away to everybody else. And then we come into this thing called a Center for Spiritual Living, this thing called church, and we say, oh, but I agree to be the co-creator, the one responsible for my life. At least for the next 30 minutes. If I can hold it that long. As long as I don't talk to anybody, as long as I don't see anything, as long as I don't hear anything, I can hold this promise. But as soon as I step out there into the world, the temptations are around me everywhere. And it becomes very challenging for me to keep my promise, to live the truth that I want to speak. So it's a practice. It's a daily practice. All the time. You have to keep coming back to the truth. You have to keep coming back to that. Do I know what I'm promising? Do I know what I'm living? Do I understand when I'm talking about the science of mind and what I've agreed to? One of the ways that we do that, for those of us who have chosen to take the Science of Mind, the textbook written by our founder, Ernest Holmes, and we've followed it throughout the year, day by day, passage by passage. And yes, I agree, some of those passages, keeping the promise not to speak ill of them. These are the words of our founder, Ernest Holmes, who was not perfect. And so some of the things we have to, in our mind, kind of shift. At the time that he wrote this, you know, the words, the speaking was everything about the man, he, him, you know, is kind of thing. And very seldom does Ernest Holmes come out and say, you know, God spoke to me and this is what she said. Yeah. But if you can break through that, if you can come out into that opening, into that expansion that says that it's really more than gender. That the words, the language is just the way in which we communicate. But it's not necessarily the universal voice. So we really become more universal when we move into that words that says, well, God is. And just leave it at that. And try not to get into identifying and trying to label it. So some of the things that Ernest Holmes was bringing into our teaching, our philosophy, was this idea of science. That he really understood that in today's world, and this was in 1926, that in today's world, science was the next great step into the evolution of the human mind. It began to open up the consciousness of who we are. That he began to step out of some of the things that we called religion. For religion has been the way in which we have, as human beings, we have identified and connected ourselves with the idea of God. So there had to be some way by which we could connect ourselves, and we wanted to, you know, put it in some kind of image. So we created the image and likeness of God to look like us. So wherever you go, whatever culture, whatever tradition, whatever faith, whatever country you're visiting, you'll notice that their gods look a lot like their people. But we say that there is only one God, and so does it look like all of us? Well, absolutely. It has to. It could be no other way, and then even something more. And that's why Ernest Holmes wanted to call it the divine intelligence. And he was getting this out of what was very popular at the time, and that was the science that was coming up in the early 1900s. And science was moving into this place called the quantum theory, about this idea that God, and I'm going to extrapolate a little bit here, but God was not an entity out there someplace, because we had gone out there looking for it and it wasn't there. And yet all of the traditions and all of the faiths and all of the religions and all of the mystics and all of the great teachers have been telling us from time immemorial that God is within. Heaven was within. It's already here. And we were going out there to look for it. In the early years of Science of Mind, there were some great scientists who were a part of our movement and who were writing regular articles in our Science of Mind magazine. We continue that tradition today. If you have a current copy of the Science of Mind magazine, you can look this up. If you don't, there's copies at the bookstore. There are a couple of scientists in the field of neurological science that are talking about how it is that we approach money. There's that word money again. I should have worn my jacket, but money. And right away when somebody mentions money, there's all kinds of fears that come up in the mind of people. And they have a way of describing this in their neurological science of how that is, how that has come about in the mind of man, that this thing that we use as just an exchange of value, it has no power in and of itself, but it has become something that we fear, something that we don't know how to control, something that we have so attached ourselves to it that if it's not in our hand in the way that we want it, when we want it, then there's some lack and limitation that we begin to live. And there is a way by which we can move out of that fear. We need to face our fears in order to move through them. Science is a way by which we can do this. Some of the early scientists, Gustav Stromberg, who was an astronomer who worked at the Wilson Observatory on Mount Wilson over there in Los Angeles, and when he retired became a regular author in the Science of Mind magazine. So he was bringing all of his scientific studies into this movement of Science of Mind because he found the connection. And he would frequently say, you know, God is not out there. And I've been looking with some of the strongest telescopes at the time in the world and can't find it. It's not out there. And yet I enter into this place, into this center, and I go within, and I'm finding it. And when I find it in here, I can see its glory and magnificence out there. And another person who became an author in the Science of Mind magazine was Max Planck, one of the early founders of this idea of quantum theory, who was talking about the same thing. That as he began to move through this idea of what is the physical universe made of, how did it get there, in that way that he was trying to discover through the natural physical laws how to identify that which is invisible, eternal, infinite, and absolute. For in the mind of God, everything is whole, perfect, and complete. The manifestation out of that infinite mind is the physical universe laid out before us, and we just have the opportunity to play with it.